Welcome to A Slice of Therapy. This podcast was created with Anchor. And if you've not heard of Anchor, let me explain. It's free. It's a really easy way to make a podcast. And it helps me because I can just do this every day directly into my phone, because there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. So if you fancy making a podcast too, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. One of the really interesting aspects of this pandemic that we're still in at the time of recording is the number of people that I've spoken to who would typically refer to themselves as people who are anxious, who struggle with feelings of anxiety. How many of them are actually feeling less anxiety in this particular situation? This situation that feels so much like we're living in a disaster movie where there are so many restrictions on what we can and can't do, that is triggering anxiety for people who wouldn't typically regard themselves as anxious. It's really interesting to me how many people who would ordinarily describe themselves as anxious are actually handling it okay, actually feel less anxious as a result. Now, to be clear, it's not everyone by any means. There are some people who regard themselves as anxious who are just as anxious or even more anxious in this situation. But it's still interesting to me that there are so many people that I've spoken to who would regard themselves as someone who struggles with anxiety, who actually feel kind of okay in the current situation. And it's really interesting because when I dig around and try and find out exactly what's going on, like how have they managed not to be feeling so anxious, even in this kind of thing that, we all fear something like this, don't we? Like a global pandemic. That even in this situation, they're not feeling it. And the thing that often comes up, well, are two things really. The first one is this idea that because this is an actual real world thing that's going on, it actually feels a little bit easier than what they're normally anxious about, which is some fear of something in the future. It's almost like those people who are feeling less anxious in this environment, they're like, okay, I'm not fearing the future now. The thing's arrived. And now it's arrived, they can deal with that. It's a real thing. It's not some sort of story about the future in their own head that's kind of tormenting. It's something real and it's external and it's in the here and now. And so on some level, for those people who are feeling less anxious, it feels that little bit easier to cope with. And the second thing that I've heard from people who are feeling less anxious despite this environment is that they talk about acceptance. They talk about the idea that they understand that there's just nothing at all that they can do about it. And so that's allowed them to let go. Now, again, to be clear, this isn't the case for all people who struggle with anxiety. There's lots of people who are more anxious as a result of this, and many more who are just as anxious as ever. But there is a large number of people who are normally anxious in their day-to-day life who are feeling much more relaxed at the moment. And the thing that they're telling me is that acceptance is something that has been really useful to them. And it's not something that they particularly tried to cultivate, but they were just placed in this situation where there was this external event and there was nothing at all that they could do about it. And so when faced with that, they found themselves just accepting the situation. And so letting go of that striving, that attempts to change the reality, because they twigged that the reality just couldn't be changed, that there happened to be this virus out there and we were all in this kind of lockdown. And so what could you do but just kind of give into it, I suppose, to let go of any attempt to try and change reality. And once they let go of any attempt to change reality and accepted the situation, their anxiety came right down. And so, in many ways, for those people whose anxiety has come down, the pandemic has actually offered them, at least, some kind of insight which allows them to realise that when faced with a problematic situation, that acceptance and letting go actually feels a nicer experience than getting anxious about it in an attempt to try and change the reality. And of course, they also recognise too that there is actually something a little bit useful in terms of getting energised, in terms of trying to solve a problem. Because of course there is, isn't there? But they're also realising that it's a much better experience, a much more soothing and calming experience to take the route of, okay, I'm just going to let this go. There's nothing I can do about it anyway, so I'm going to relax. And there's two routes, isn't there, when there's nothing you can do about the situation. It's like route one is everybody panic. There's nothing we can do about it. And the second one is everybody relax. There's nothing we can do about it. And those people who would typically regard themselves as anxious day to day, who are feeling much less anxious, even in the midst of this crisis, are telling me that they've organically fell into that second path of let's relax, there's nothing we can do about it anyway. And so there's a great power in acceptance of a situation, or at least of having a limit to how much we try and change reality. Because when in a situation where we're in a reality that simply can't be changed, that the virus will not bend to our will, then what people have realised is that they actually feel more soothed, more calm than they usually do. And they've fallen into this insight that acceptance and letting go is actually a nicer experience than feeling agitated and trying to impose their will on the reality. And so many of those who I've spoken to have thought, well, actually, I'm going to try this in future. Once all this situation is over and we're back to the humdrum of daily life, as things go wrong, many of them have vowed to remember this moment, to remember what it was like to be in a situation where there was nothing that you could do about it, and actually how freeing and liberating that was in the moment. And so that they vow to themselves that they're going to remember this and try that again in the future. Maybe not all the time, because like I say, sometimes it's good, isn't it, to be energised and solve a problem. But what they've said is that in future, when problems come about, they're going to remember that this is a tool that they had no option but to use here in this crisis. And it worked for them. It made life nicer. And so they're going to use it again. And so if you like this idea too, and you find it helpful to experiment with I'm going to let this go. I'm going to act as if There's nothing I can do about this, and just get on with life. And of course, there's things that's wise not to do about, and there's other things that it's wise to try that out with as well and experiment with. But if you like this idea, then feel free to pass it on so other people can benefit. If you'd like to work with me one-to-one, I'm Alun Parry. You can find me at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. If you want to subscribe to the podcast, it's completely free. Just subscribe wherever you typically get them. And you can watch them online as well. Just go to asliceoftherapy.com if you prefer to see them as a video. And I'll be back again with another podcast tomorrow. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you then.